emoluments of the president, but Trump is getting rich, or maybe not rich. Maybe he's trying to achieve solvency by being president. This may be the main goal. But he's earning a lot of money by foreign dignitaries paying a lot in one way or another to the Trump organization. This is against the Constitution. Doesn't matter right now. This is done with impunity. A second crucial way forward is an independent judiciary. This goes back also to biblical times. The injunctions to the judge to be unbiased is an essential, from Leviticus onward, essential recognition, a key step towards justice and the control of power. A third is public participation in politics. The places that are least corrupt are the ones that have the most public participation. They tend to be, as I'll mention in a moment, smaller places where politics still is on the retail level, not the mass media level where people can really participate in a Swiss canton or in a local election, and the local election matters. A fourth recommendation, or a fourth institutional limit, is parliamentarism rather than rule by one. Any advice to any new country: do not have a president. This was a bad idea. It was maybe a good idea in 1789 compared to a monarch, but a bad idea in the 21st century. Presidential systems are more corrupt than parliamentary systems. Parliamentary systems inherently have more dispersed power, coalitions. They're not immune to corruption, but
in Italy we have a lot
yes.
of corruption.
No. I was going to say they're not immune to corruption, but they tend to control it better. Term limits is one of my favorite ways forward, for the very simple reason that corruption takes time. Corruption generally requires complex systems. Throwing out the bums and bringing in the new ones is a good idea. The new ones will not know how to be as corrupt as the old ones. It takes time to build up the systems, and even neurobiologically they won't be as corrupt as the old ones. So I think that rotation of power is extremely important. Another dimension is countervailing power, fight power with power. One of the ways that has worked in Scandinavia is strong trade unions as a counterpoint to strong companies. It's not fail-safe, but it is a potential way forward. Of course, free speech, whistleblowers, the ability to call out corruption is also linked to transparency of institutions, are critical dimensions of control. As Marcelo emphasized, in today's world, corporations are major sources of corruption. The whole idea of corporations has gotten completely out of hand. Even their legal framework, starting with limited liability, tells us all who should have limited liability to do unlimited damage. But that's what modern corporations have become. And so corporate accountability is crucial. And then fighting against impunity, social norms that help to say, again, this is not right. Because we have even lost, of course, in places of pervasive corruption, the idea that this is wrong rather than this is normal. And when corruption becomes normal, the ability to counteract it, of course, is nearly lost. Next. When corruption is transnational, we need transnational means of control. they are not strong in our world. We have the UN Charter, which is supposed to limit the power of the powerful vis-a-vis the weak. This is the genius of the United Nations. It works once in a while. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a moral charter of the world. It could never be adopted now. Can you imagine governments in the world agreeing to a declaration of human rights? It would be unimaginable, but it happened in the wake of World War II in 1948, and it remains a core document for us. We have the need to defend indigenous and community rights because these are the rights that are so abused by international power. As our previous meeting emphasized, indigenous peoples are the most vulnerable, most attacked peoples in the world because they sit on land that has resources that the greediest people in the world and companies are after. We have, at least in principle, anti-corruption laws that have some effect. We could fight for transparency of international contracting, greater accountability of corporations, ending tax and secrecy havens, which are principal vehicles of global corruption, and increased litigation, legal actions against corporate corruption. Just some ideas for our discussion. Next. We have Jerem Brooks of Transparency International, so we're looking forward to very much to your wisdom. Transparency International is the global keeper of the scorecard of perceptions of corruption around the world. The least corrupt countries in the most recent rankings are New Zealand, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Switzerland, Singapore, Sweden. Interestingly, they're all countries of a few million people. I think that that is actually not an accident. They are places where politics is really local. Maybe the Swiss canton is the ultimate example of that. Closest to Aristotle's polis, with also the advantages of no slaves, and even Switzerland now has universal suffrage. It took hundreds of years, but the women finally got the vote also. But these are all small places. I've always been impressed in these countries how politicians are forced to mingle with people. We went in Denmark to Bornholm, where there's a democracy festival, and the ministers and prime minister are just walking around or on their bicycles with the public because it's a small country. It's got democratic norms, no protection, no police protection, and so on. In the United States, I always noted when Obama came to New York, which invariably, by the way, was to raise money in the Upper East Side. He never went to Harlem. He never went to poor places. He always went to raise money from you'd come and the city would be cordoned off for several hours that you couldn't move because of the weight of security. This is to move an American president. It's grotesque, but it shows how politics is completely removed from the people. And we're supposed to be a democracy, but it's a very fragile one indeed. So I think that the small size is part of it. There are many other features of these honest countries, or relatively honest countries, but one notes that the toleration of corruption is extremely low. I always liked the fact that in the two television shows of national politics, we had the House of Cards in the United States till Kevin Spacey was kicked out for his own corruption. But we had House of Cards on U.S. politics and Borgen on Danish politics. In Danish politics, the big crime was the prime minister used his official credit card temporarily for a private purchase, and he lost power. because he wasn't able to make the shift of the accounts until the next Monday. In the United States, of course, the worst crime is that the president-to-be pushes the reporter in front of a train and kills her. So it was murder versus inappropriate use of a credit card. That pretty much says it all, in my view, of the difference of Denmark being number 2 and the United States being quite far down on the list of the rich countries. If you go to, yeah.
For the banks, you put United Kingdom, but all the banks,
Yes.
of traffic are in this.
So let me just say we'll hear what this is. This is survey, or this is expert and survey data combined that give these rankings. They're not my rankings, but Transparency International, I'll let Jerem talk about those in due course. If we look at the other side of the list on the next slide, the most corrupt countries, Cambodia, Congo, DRC, Tajikistan, Chad, Eritrea, Angola, Turkmenistan, Iraq, Venezuela, North Korea, Equatorial Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Libya, Sudan, Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, Somalia. There are
Well, not there.
Not Argentina.
Success.
This is this is only a courtesy for you, Cadiz.
It used to be.
Also for me.
It used to be said, how did Nigeria get higher on the list? Well, it paid a bribe in front of the other countries. All of these countries lack any control on the executive. Many are at war, of course. Many are resource rich. Yes? Well,
Argentina was taken off the
yeah, right. Argentina needed its own scale. Next. Let me just say a word about my own country for a moment. The United States, we have become, the U.S. has a long, long history of corruption, so it has not been immune ever to corruption. And the U.S. has an extraordinarily violent history, one of the most violent in the world, of mass genocides of Native Americans and of slavery until the Civil War. It's the only country I know of that had to have a civil war to end slavery rather than doing it peacefully. So the U.S. Abuse of power is completely contrary to the image of the United States, but has been part of the U.S. Political history from the very beginning. But now there's a sense that money in politics is reaching a new high, similar to or exceeding the Gilded Age. And the American public for a long time has believed that politics is very corrupt. It's very interesting. The decline of U.S. confidence in government came from the 1950s to the 1970s. In the 1950s and early 1960s, Americans were very confident of government, very trusting in government. World War II was viewed as a just war and a victory by government. Government was viewed as highly competent and trustworthy. Then came the assassination of President Kennedy, the assassinations at the end of the 1960s, the Vietnam War, and all of the lying, Watergate. By the mid-1970s, the confidence in the U.S. government by the public had deteriorated to unprecedented low levels, and it has never recovered from the mid-1970s onward. The sense that America's run not for the public, not for the common good, but for big interests came during exactly that period. You look that 64% said that government is run for the benefit of all people in 1964, and it fell to 25% by Watergate in 1974, and it never really picked up again except the one blip after 9/11, which was a patriotic rally. But basically, the U.S. lost faith in government in the 1960s, and it has never come back. Next. Yesterday was the headline, Trump tax cut unlocks millions for Republican election blitz. This is the formal corruption of the U.S. system, which is that we have legalized corporate money in politics through a deliberate campaign of corporate interests that began in the early 1970s. It's interesting we can identify the one author of this who started this, Lewis Powell, who was a lawyer for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and for the tobacco industry. And he wrote a famous memo in 1971 saying that corporations needed to fight for political power. He was put on the Supreme Court and in 1978 wrote the first opinion that companies have First Amendment rights of free speech, and that became the basis for decisions that companies could give unlimited anonymous sums of money to politicians as a matter of their free speech. And this is part of the deconstruction of American politics in recent decades. What's happened now is that we had a tax cut last year, about $2 trillion transferred mainly to the rich, opened up big budget deficits. It is very unpopular. It was unpopular, but it is leading to a huge wave of corporate contributions for these midterm elections. In the U.S. system, money matters in politics for turnout because the system is designed to suppress voter participation of poor people and minorities. And so you have to spend a lot of money to bring people to the polls and to keep your opponents from bringing people to the polls. And this is why money matters so much in our politics. Instead of just showing up to vote, it takes a tremendous effort to mobilize voters by design, and those with money are able to do it. Next. This is showing the total spending on elections. You can see that the cost of our election cycles has been rising steadily from the 1998 at the bottom, when the election cycle was about 1.5 billion spent, to 2016 when it was more than $6 billion spent. So $6 billion mainly came from rich donors, and this, of course, corrupts the political system. Next. Lobbying also runs at about $3.5 billion a year in Washington by corporate interests, rising sharply from the late 1990s. I think that's it. Next. That's it, yeah. So these are just thoughts of where we might want to focus our discussion. We're looking at systemic political corruption and the interaction of powerful money, corporate interests, and politics. We're looking for solutions, cases, success stories, examples of how we can overcome what is this enormous wave of despair for most of the world. Just to end with underscoring what Marcelo said, the costs of this corruption are tremendously high. The confidence in democracy has clearly weakened everywhere. The economic impacts are profound. The loss of justice is profound. And there's lots of evidence that in terms of the sense of human well-being, the fact of living within a corrupt society is itself a major burden on people. People do not like to live in societies that they feel are fundamentally unfair. And this shows up in the strong relationship, negative relationship between the expressed sense of life satisfaction and the level of corruption in a country, even holding constant the level of income. So it's not only the direct effects on, or the indirect effects on reducing income levels, but also the direct effects of the sense of injustice and how that weighs on us. So thank you very much, and we now move to discussion. Marcelo, please. Thank you.
Thank you, really, Jeff, for this incredible panorama about the question. When Kissinger visited our academy, and Kissinger is, you know, near to the Republican Party, and so there are many things. But he said one thing that to me was very important. The new scenario of the world today is in the Pacific Ocean, the countries that are in the Pacific Ocean. So, like in the past, the scenario go from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, today go from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And one of the more important protagonists, also say Kissinger, and it's evident, is China. What is the situation of China? That we can know, because we know that it's a mystery, but anyway, what is your idea about this? Because it's important to understand.
Yeah.
And then
I think there's no doubt that within China and by evidence, China faces massive corruption and knows it. And indeed, President Xi's anti-corruption campaign was partly his political effort of securing his own power base and eliminating opposition, but it was also partly because of the pervasive corruption of the Communist Party. And there's a lot of evidence of this tremendous amount of money moving out of China into tax havens or round trips through Hong Kong and other havens. And China has all of the difficult hallmarks. It is not a society of public participation. It is not a society of transparency. It is not a society of limitation on executive power. It has been incredibly successful economically over the last 40 years. This is the 40th anniversary of Deng Xiaoping coming to power, and it's been the most spectacular economic rise in history. A real one, not a flim-flam one. It's real, but it has been done by a top-down leadership and a very capable state in a lot of ways, because the quality of professional governance of the Chinese state has been very high. It's been governed by engineers for 40 years. One of the brilliant points of its success was the alternation of power. So one thing that China did, even within its one-party state, was to insist on the regular rotation of power. Every 5 years for a number of Politburo members and every 10 years for the leader. President Xi just instituted an end to the term limits. Nobody knows what this means exactly, but for me it was one of the big potential missteps of China for its own good, because the rotation of power has been absolutely the friend of China's success by preventing the deep entrenchment of power. Whether he actually stays more than 2 terms is really an open question. It's not an obvious point. The idea that he's declared himself president for life, I don't believe. I think China's more institutionalized than that. But this was still a very odd step. So China has not solved this problem. And Chinese society is very unequal. Its income distribution has widened markedly. It's going to have the most billionaires in the world soon. It will overtake the United States in this shortly. So China's future is up for grabs, I would say. I don't think that there is any, and China's approach to this, I think, not to be naive, but I do think that the traditional approach to this, which really is 2,000 years old, is that the virtue that it's not by the division of power or checks and balances, but rather the virtue of the state under a Confucian order is the strategy. It could work if the emperor believes the need for the mandate of heaven comes from the respect of the harmonious society and order. It's a fragile reed in today's world to hope for that, and it really depends on, I would say, a lot of luck for China to be able to pull this through. So I don't think that China's any remedy to this, nor would I say that they would regard themselves in any way as a role model. In the rest of Asia, the situation is a very mixed picture. There is Singapore is a fascinating example of a state which is perceived to have very low corruption in an authoritarian setting. One of these small states, which Lee Kuan Yew put in a particular direction. And I do think that the sense that Singapore lives according to the rule of law with low corruption is on the whole correct. Maybe it's weakening a little bit. Japan and Korea are both rather corrupt in their politics. Of course, Korea just deposed a president because of corruption. Japan, huge amounts of money changes hands in politics. So Japan is not at all immune to this. The difference in Japan is that when the corruption is exposed, people bow and they leave. Whereas in the United States, they fight like hell and generally have to be dragged from office. So there is still a Bushido tradition in Japan that somehow still plays a role, but there is lots of corruption. So I think that this is a worldwide phenomenon. I don't think that it's a case where we're going to find salvation in another part of the world that is somehow immune from all of these deep tendencies.
Thank you.
We're unfortunately running a little behind. This session we have Cardinal Rodriguez and German to speak, but our break is supposed to be in 20 minutes. So I propose that we go ahead and see how far we get with Cardinal Rodriguez, and we might have to rejiggle a little bit. But Cardinal.